Our second scripture this morning is from the book of Romans. I don't know that I've ever preached Romans out of the lectionary on Pentecost, but so be it for today. Listen to the word of the Lord for you this day from Romans chapter 8. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will be set free from its enslavement to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning together as it suffers together the pains of labor. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what one already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but that very Spirit intercedes with groanings too deep for words. And God, who searches our hearts, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We seek God, cry out for help in the darkness. Nevertheless, Christmas. We grieve what we think can never be when death triumphs. Nevertheless, Easter, resurrection. We assume exclusivity in our faith. Nevertheless, Peter and Paul, and a thriving community of Gentile Jesus followers. We assume merit, nevertheless, grace. I never really thought about nevertheless being an important word in our faith practice, but it seems that most of the stories of our faith, most of the celebrations, most everything involves some great nevertheless. As Jesus returns to the Father, ascending into the heavens, the disciples are left to themselves with the instructions to return to Jerusalem and just wait. And you know we're really good at that whole just wait thing, right? Especially if we don't know what we're waiting for, or how long we need to wait. I don't know about y'all, but I have noticed that the tourists are here for the summer season, and they don't even wait for stop signs. I mean, we don't wait well. Welcome to the I know. It was hilarious in front of Starbucks yesterday. It was like there was some kind of giveaway for a drug. I mean, people were just crazy. So, back to the disciples. They didn't have Starbucks. What a journey they've taken, right? Up and down and up and down. And what now? How could they live ordinary days without Jesus actually before them and among them? How could they live without the healing and the teaching and the loving that changed the world around them? I'm guessing they didn't have a whole lot to say because they didn't have any answers. The profound grief of the death of Jesus then gave way to this indescribable emotion as Jesus actually returned, resurrected, and lived with them for another 40 days. And then took them up on this mountain and said, guys and gals, be my witnesses. And go out into the whole world. And then he left them again. Kind of guessing that they didn't even know how to feel as they were together in that room. because a resurrected man told them, to wait. Nevertheless, Pentecost. But that great nevertheless is not the end of a story, any story, but a continuance, a connector, a turning point. It just so happened, I think by the work of the Spirit, go figure, that I began reading this book this week titled People Love Dead Jews. I have to admit the title hooked me. And the author is Jewish. Her name is Dara Horn, and she wrote this book about anti-Semitism, but in very unique perspectives, very unique ways. So chapter 5 is titled Fictional Dead Jews. And it's about what literature does with the Jewish people and their suffering and their experiences in history, and how really we expect particular things from the death of Jews in our fiction. So Horn, who is a highly educated scholar in Hebrew and Yiddish literature, suggests to her readers that Jewish literature is kind of an anti-literature, in that it seldom has a coherent and satisfying ending, which is what we Westerners expect that literature is. We even think of the Bible as beginning at the beginning, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, and ending with Revelation's promise of heaven back on the earth again, and God here living among God's people. But the Jewish scripture doesn't follow that pattern, and really neither does the New Testament, but we'll get to that. The Torah, the first 5 books of Hebrew scripture, Genesis, Exodus, do you know them? Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, read in its entirety every year in synagogue, doesn't have much finality. Moses dies. That's the end of that. But the people that Moses has brought to the point of entering the promised land, which has been the whole story, they don't go in. They are left outside of the promised land when Moses dies. It's no particular ending. It's not a happy, neat, wrap it all up kind of story. Because of the way Western literature works, the New Testament kind of leans this way. There's a lot of Greek influence in it. But we still don't see a lot of endings. For example, we've just been talking about the story of Stephen, right? And the choosing of these 7 new disciples, and the fact that Stephen was so holy, was so good, was so good at witnessing to the life of Christ that it made everybody mad, and they stoned him to death. And that's the end of that story, except it's not, because what happened to those other 7 people and all the other disciples in their charge? And were you ever curious about that? The beloved musical Fiddler on the Roof is part of this canon of Jewish literature that Dara Horn talks about. And this was all new information to me. It's a great Broadway musical. It's based on a story written by Shalom Aleichem called Tevye and His Daughters, or Tevye the Dairyman. And it's kind of like Grimm's fairy tales, only Jewish literature. We would not like Aleichem's story in any way. Tevye's wife drops dead, his son-in-law drops dead, and his daughter drowns herself in the grief. And then the story goes on episodically to tell about the marriages of each of his other daughters, which go from bad to worse to worse. Every one of them is more disastrous than the one before. So typically, as in most of these stories, Tevye never changes. He doesn't learn a lesson. He doesn't have an epiphany. He doesn't realize a truth that makes things better. He's not rescued. He's not saved. He just endures his life. The futility, the decay, day after terrible day. And yet, nevertheless, hope is alive in Tevye. He grieved for his wife and his son-in-law and his daughter, and he lost his home. He was expelled. But at the end of the story, he offers a couple of sentences that embrace the same kind of hope that Paul expressed, much more poetically. Tevye says, "Tell all the Jews everywhere that they shouldn't worry. Our old God still lives." We as a people crave coherence and resolution, and everything that we learn needs to be put into that kind of structure in our mind. It needs to fit together. It needs to have a happy ending. Pentecost here wraps up the biblical celebrations and festivals of the first half of our liturgical year. And what we do is we look back on these things and we try to make a story start to finish from them. We took the episodes of Jesus' birth in Matthew and Luke. There's not one in Mark. And in John, it's a poetic incarnation story, not birth story. But we make it a mashup and we tell a story like it exists start to finish. And then we bring the Old Testament in by going back and looking at the words of the prophets and saying, see, that's what they were talking about. That's what they were talking about. But even when we do that, even when we try to make our sacred text coherent and whole, the creation still groans. Rome did not take the story and the reality of resurrection and the events of the day of Pentecost and pack up their soldiers and leave Israel and Judea and Palestine. They still occupied the land, even though we proclaim that God has won over death and evil. Paul had this great insight, this great conversion event, was a superb preacher, started churches all across that part of the world, and was constantly in jail, beaten, punished, starved, chased. Creation continued to groan. The promise of glory, this text tells us, is as great as the suffering. Paul writes it to the church at Rome, and it's a poetic celebration of hope in the midst of decay and bondage. And I wondered after listening to this book if it wasn't a very Jewish celebration. I think Paul could well have summarized this text by saying, nevertheless, our old God still lives. We still groan. Creation still groans. It was the warmest winter on this planet in the history of taking temperatures on this planet. The danger in insisting on coherence is that it never exists. We even redefined baptism culturally as a sign of a commitment to turning to God and made it a checkbox. Okay, once you're baptized, you're saved, you're going to heaven, not hell, done. Great. If people can't find a coherent story to solve the evil in their lives, They throw up the hands and say, well, there's either no God or it's no God I'd want to worship. Creation still groans. Decay and bondage still rule. Nevertheless, our old God still lives. The birth of God incarnate, the resurrection, the inclusive gospel message, the Spirit breaking into a regular day, it could happen here, with power and prophecy. These are not pinnacle events, not endings. They are moments in which we see the work of God. They are moments that a deeply scarred, deeply yearning creation is reminded that we and the world in which we live are still deeply sacred. It's no accident, I don't think, that Paul chose birth pains to describe the hurt in his passage, because a birth pain has a hope attached to it. And Paul reminds God's people that they are not defined by their groaning, but by the Spirit. And he reminds them that it's not the way things are, it's the way things will be. For our great nevertheless is that our old God still lives. And we can endure. And we can follow, even when there's no resolution. I'm sure all of you could name someone who were such faithful disciples of Christ, and yet their lives seem to be one suffering after another, after another, after another. And you've heard this. Why on earth can that person not have some good in their life? Because they bring so much good to others. We can follow when there's no resolution. And we hope, because hope by definition is unseen. And because we are already saved by God's work, even if we don't know it, or if we forget how to live outside of that bondage and decay. And that hope will give us endurance to grieve, but still live and work as God's people. And the Spirit will pray with words that we can only groan. And God will know. Interestingly, I think as we move away from our festivals and celebrations into the second half of the year, which is just ordinary worship, we begin to live the real story. A story with no coherence, no beginning, no end. More suffering than we ever want to deal with, suffering that we may cause, intentionally or unintentionally, chaos at every turn, not a celebration or a festival in sight to distract us or remind us that God is at work. Nevertheless, our old God still lives.